Hello, everyone. Hopefully, it's a good day for you to be watching this work session. Today's work session is on the fractured glass star. The fractured glass is part of the Stella Maris Mixer collection. And the units were designed to fit into the slots for round 4. And if you turn to the back of your pattern on page 4, you can see the location and the design of the element. So let's go back to page 1 in your instructions, and at the very top in the first header it talks about Ziploc bags. You need 2 Ziploc bags for this pattern. You're going to label one of those as M1 and the other one is going to be labeled as M2. Okay. Underneath that, you're going to work with the foundation papers. Now, hopefully you've already pre-cut out your foundation papers, but if you haven't, what you need to do, you have 2 foundation units, newsprints here. One is NP774 and then the other one is NP775. You'll need to cut out the foundation papers. I want you to put the unit ML pieces into bag M1, and I want the unit M2 pieces placed into bag, the unit MR pieces, which is your right unit. Those go into bag M2. The foundation or the templates and template layout sheets, just set them aside in another bag until you're ready to start cutting. And I will show you how to use them during the cutting instructions. If you put those in the bag now, there's more of a chance of you losing them, and sometimes the templates have to be split between 2 bags. So it's easier for us to just set them aside in a separate bag, and we'll get back to those. If you go to the top of page 1, under the fractured glass fabric instructions, there's the instructions for your color chart. I want you guys to set up your fabric swatches and glue them in place so that you can reference them as you go through your instructions. Underneath that, there's a color layout. The color layouts are set up to show you the position of each one of the fabrics and what units they pair up. So what we're doing in that color chart is we're pairing the fabric numbers to the section numbers on your foundation papers. Okay. For some beginners, sometimes they like to take a little fabric swatch and actually glue those fabric swatches to the foundation papers. It's not necessary if you are familiar with our techniques, but we do use that little tip sometimes for our beginners. All right, I'm going to take a break and catch up to my notes here. Underneath the color layout, you're going to find the headers for the fabric numbers that we're using. And we're only working with 2. So on page 1, we have fabric M1. And right along with that header, it tells you what template layout sheet you're using. And it's going to be numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Or it may tell you what the T template is that you will be working with. So you need to pay attention to those headers. On page 2, we have the other fabric number, which is M2. And again, it's going to tell you what layout sheets are going to be used with that fabric. So let's flip back to page 1. So underneath step 1, or right around step 1, I like to put a fabric swatch. This will really help you, especially if you have to put this pattern aside and come back and work on it at a later date. if you'll have the fabric swatches and you just put a little fabric swatch with those instructions, sometimes I put it right next to the header, sometimes I'll put it onto the fabric where it shows you cutting the strips, and sometimes I'll put it right along the side. But it keeps you from actually picking up the wrong stack of fabric and cutting the wrong pieces when you're following those instructions. And you will find as you start doing some of our patterns that template layout sheets have a tendency to look alike between one unit and another, so it just really helps to have those swatches on there. I have only 2 swatches. So I've already done most of my prep work, and so I'm going to show you what your prep work should look like if you have done it already. If you haven't, you're going to get the go through and do your prep work before you start cutting. So the first thing I'm going to show you is I have my bags. I have bag M1 and I have bag M2. And underneath that bag I have my unit listed, and that's unit ML and MR. So it helps me when I'm sorting my fabrics after they're cut to make sure I'm putting them in with the right units. So we have our 2 bags there. We actually only have 2 fabric pieces with this grouping. And what I did is I went through my instructions after I had all of my fabrics cut, and I found my template layout sheets, and I paired the layout sheets up with the fabric strips so that if I don't have time to cut everything at once at one setting, I can leave my fabric stacked and come back and continue through the cutting, but I don't have to keep looking for my layout sheets. So it really helps to actually pair all of those up. So for fabric M1, I have template layout sheet number 1 and number 2. And if you look, we list what those layout sheets are called right on the pattern, if you can see where my fingers are pointing. All right. Now, this little strip set, these are the template, and this one is on page 2, and this is template layout sheet number 3 and number 4, and I have both of them stacked here, and we're just going to keep those clipped to the strips until we're ready to go. The other thing that's going to help you guys out to organize yourself so that if you have to leave it in the middle of your cutting is to set up your strips prior to your cutting. And I open all of my strips up so that everything is stacked. And if I have to separate them afterwards because of my instructions, it's still just a lot easier if everything is stacked right side up and opened up. So I like to get that ready and prepared. You should also have your little labels onto your fabric that tells you what that is, and you want to leave that label on there until you actually start cutting. All right. And we're going to do the same thing for there. So we're going to start back here for fabric M1, and it tells me to cut and stack 8 4.5-inch strips, which that is what I have here. I'm going to slip my notes underneath my instructions. I have 8 strips, and then I need to read that instructions just a little bit because I need to know if I have to divide my strips or not. And in this one, it says to stack the 8 strips right side up, which I have all 8 strips stacked together. Step 2 tells me what my template layout sheets are, and there again you want to follow that information, and we have the layout sheets, and if you look at your pictures you can pretty much tell how those layout sheets are supposed to be positioned. Now, one of the things that you need to do is you need to have these layout sheets trimmed right to the size. When you're cutting them out of the paper, a lot of times you cut them a little bit bigger, but you're going to save a lot of effort if you actually trim them right to the size of the lines around the perimeter. So I'm going to trim all of this excess off. And I'm going to grab the other one. I thought that I had trimmed these last night, but apparently I missed these pieces. Now, the accuracy is not all that important, but sometimes your template layout sheets are only about 1/4 of an inch less in the width as your strips. And if that's the case, if your strips aren't stacked really straight along the edges, you may be a little bit short on there. So sometimes it's just nice to have your layout sheets trimmed right on that line. We're going to use our repositionable glue, and I'm going to put it on the back of both of my layout sheets. You should let that dry for about 30 seconds, 30, 40 seconds. I'm not very patient. I have a tendency to put it on before it's ready. So we're going to take this piece and we're going to place this right on the top of my fabric, and we're going to press that paper into it. And we love our repositionable glue because the glue stays with the paper as long as you put it on the paper and let it dry just a little bit. It doesn't stick to the fabric once you remove the paper. And you can use this 2 or 3 times. After a while, it starts wearing out. All right, now in step 3, it tells me to go ahead and trim my pieces to the shape of the template layout sheet. So I'm just going to take this and I don't worry about being accurate with my cut. I just make sure that I cut outside that line, and if I have to cut right next to it, that's fine as well. But like along this edge, I don't need to go back in and clean that up. So we're going to put our paper clips, and we're going to put a paper clip on each one of these section pieces. And now it tells me to cut these apart. And I am going to cut them apart, but I will tell you, if you're not planning on setting down and sewing, it's best to leave them together if they don't have to be split between 2 bags. And this one actually just goes in 1 bag. So this piece here is my ML. And I'm going to look at my paper piecing instructions. And it tells me that I'm going to use the ML pieces for my paper piecing. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this group. And then I'm going to stack them and try to keep the numbers somewhat stacked. And I'm going to stack them with my sew sides. And then we're just going to put a binder clip on that group. And these pieces go into bag M1. So we're going to slip those in there. Now we're going to come back over here. And I'm going to cut along this edge. Put our paper clips on it. Now on this unit, I'm not going to cut these apart right now because I'm not going to show you guys how to do the paper piecing on this particular unit. So I'm going to wait until I'm ready to actually paper piece. These go into bag M2. So our next set of instructions is on page 2, and it's fabric M2. There's 2 layout sheets. It tells me to stack 8 strips right side up, and the strips are all they measure about 1.5 inches. And I'm going to go ahead and cut the ends off. And before I start slicing off these ends, I always look at my graphics to make sure that I'm not going to, you know, if I'm going to have enough room there to cut off the excess. And this one's pretty tight, so, but I still have to get this end off. So I'm going to be a little careful here. So let's take our template layout sheets. We're going to put our glue on the back side of them. That's repositionable glue. And let it dry for just a little bit. And then it tells me to put template layout sheet number 3 on the first half of my stack. This is number 4. This is number 3. And we have plenty of room. And I didn't trim this one down, but these are pretty easy pieces. And this is this goes in bag M2. These are for my MR pieces, so we're going to place these into bag M2. And then we're going to take the second half of our strip, line those up a little bit better, and position this piece on. Now we're going to slice these pieces apart. And these go into bag M1. The next part of our video is going to be on how to stack. I'm going to show you how to stack the pieces in bag M1. We have our foundation papers. It says here that section 8 is my very last piece. So I'm going to find the template that says section 8, and I'm going to place my sew sides away from me. And then we're going to find the template for section 7, which is on the bottom of my pile there. So we're going to stack the sew side. Then we need section 6, my sew side. This will be for section 5, section 4, section 3, and section 1. Okay. And this is my section 1 there. So what I want to do here is I'm going to show you how to do one unit. And so I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to pull the very bottom piece off, and I'm going to restack everything. And then I like to put a paper clip right on my sew side. And the rest of these, I'm going to leave them on my table, because if I need my template, I don't want to have to dig through the bag to find the template pieces for it. We're going to use one of our foundation papers. And this is pretty easy to put together. So we're going to take the very first piece, and we're actually going to place it wrong side up. And I'm going to use my repositionable glue and put just a little bit of glue on the back of that paper. While that's drying, I'm going to turn on my machine. And I'm going to clean off my table so that I can do my paper piecing. So I need my, and then I need to find my add-a-quarter ruler. You're going to have to cut this out. I have my add-a-quarter ruler here, and I'm going to move my book off to the side. I'm just going to close it because I really don't need it for this part. And we're going to place our very first piece. And so we have the wrong side of the paper to the wrong side of the fabric. Okay. I'm going to move these pieces up a little bit. We need to find sew line, or we have to fold back on line 1. And I'm going to point out on this unit here that we have 3 dashed lines on this piece. And the reason why is because when we put these units together and sew them, we want to repress one of the seams. So if you look at and read the writing on here, it says repress lines 1 and 2 after the paper piecing's done. So after the paper is removed, you repress those seams. You can't repress them until after the paper's moved. So anytime you have it reads repress a seam, you need to mark that piece with a little note so that after you remove the paper, you'll know that you want to go in there and repress those. And the reason for the repressing is so that you can get your pieces to come together with opposing seams. And sometimes our patterns require that because there's just too much bulk to get the seams to stack. And this happens to be the reason for this one. So pay attention to your line 1 because it's kind of buried in here. And we're going to place the fold template on there. Fold back and trim. Our very first piece is going to sit on here like this. And this is such easy fitting that you shouldn't have a problem with anything not working. I'm just going to pick it up and I'm going to open it up. I would normally glue if I'm stacking, but when I'm working with one piece, I don't need to glue. I can hold on to it. I got to set my stitch length and I'm going down to 1.8. And we're going to sew on that line. And then we're going to finger press. And open up that seam. My iron is not hot. Let it warm up here just a little bit. That's good enough. We're going to flip this over. We're going to find line 2. And again, pay close attention to line 2. It's the solid line because it's kind of buried in all of that information there. Fold back. Add a quarter and trim. Take it to our machine. And sew on line 2. I'll do some finger pressing there and then press with the iron. So on line 3, pause. Okay, we took a shortcut there, and we have 2 more pieces to add. This is my very last piece, which is line 7. And I'm going to put a little glue on it because my fabric unit's getting so heavy that it's slipping on me as I'm sewing. So if you feel like you need to put some glue on there, it's okay. That's what my piece looks like before it's pressed and ironed. I'm going to go press it. And I should have said pressed and trimmed. So now we're going to actually trim this piece. No, we're not. We're not quite done. I need to come in and do a TRP line here, and I need to sew a TRP line right in here. I do want to point out that at this TRP line right here, this is where I'm supposed to do some of my repressing. And these TRP lines are on the outside of my block, so they're going to be used when I assemble the quilt. If I sew across that seam that I'm supposed to repress, then I'm not going to be able to repress that seam. So what I need to do is make sure that I start the TRP line right where it shows and just do a real small one to work with there. The other one, it doesn't matter. So there's my first TRP line. And then the second one, I'm going to start on the edge. And I'm going to sew in, but I don't want to sew over that seam allowance. That way I'll be able to repress when I'm ready to do the repressing. Now we're ready to trim. So I'm going to grab my ruler here. And we're going to line this up right along that black line. And that is the perimeter, the outside line is your perimeter and your cutting line. Then we're going to take and we're going to cut our smart corner. And before I cut that, because this is wanting to move on me, we're going to put a little bit of glue on that and line that up, because the fabric is wanting to move underneath the paper. And that'll hold that tip in place. And I'll line that up a little bit better. There we go, perfect. Now we're going to cut that off. One of the things I notice a lot about my students when they're beginners is they have a tendency to always trim just outside that black line. You need to be trimming right on that line. Don't trim outside it, because if you trim outside, you're adding about a 1/16 of an inch to the size of every block throughout your quilt. And by the time you start sewing those pieces together, they're not going to fit properly. And your quilt's not going to lay flat. So make sure you're trimming on the line. let's grab our scissors and we're going to cut the threads on our TRP lines. And we now have one completed block. I'm going to show you how to remove the foundation papers, and then we'll show you how to repress that seam. So I always start on the very last line that I did my sewing, hold my fingers right at the edge so that I don't pull the stitches out right. You're going to lift the fabric and then hold each one of those seams. So I have my finger right on that stitch line. And before I pull on it, I'm going to hold onto the stitch line and then start tearing the paper. When you get down to your TRP lines, just remove the paper around that sew line there, the TRPs. Don't just yank on it, because sometimes you'll pull those threads out. So this is the last two seams. I'm supposed to repress these two seams to go this direction. Before I do that, I want to come in and I'm going to fold back the seam and I'm going to trim the dog ears as those seams are folded back. That will take the bulk out of your pieces when you start sewing your main seams together. Just go ahead and go up all the way on that. Okay. So when you're looking at the back, you can kind of see how it's got this little angle now. So when I start sewing, it takes the bulk out of my seam allowance on those where you have double heavy seams from paper piecing. So now we're going to go finger press this and finger press this one, and then we're going to repress that seam. And normally I like to leave a little piece of paper that says repress seam, just something as a note, so that when I start to assemble, I remember that that has to be done. And that's what your unit's going to look like on the back side, and that's what it's going to look like on the front side. So I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to put it with my stack here, and I'm going to see if my binder clip will fit and hold those together. There we go. I'm going to place all of this back into my bag one until I'm ready to finish them. So let's go back to our instructions and let's go through a couple other things. I showed you how to do the paper piecing for the ML unit. You're going to repeat those same steps for the M2, for the MR2 unit, which is your right unit. And we have a picture there in your instructions that show you how to stack. The first step is showing you how to get started. Underneath that, you're going to find where it says block assembly instructions. You're going to need to read that, because your block assembly, some of these blocks that we're working with, you have to sew one or two pieces together, but these pieces are not sewn together because it's a full unit, and these are actually joined in the process of assembling the whole quilt. So After you read this, it's going to tell you under finishing the block to avoid Y seams in the assembly process. Units in this booklet are not joined at this time. So we're done once we get the paper piecing. Thank you.